A portrait is always connected to emotion because someone thought that this was an important person. Whether it's important for society, that's still emotional. We have a lot of emotions about the people who lead us, or if it's a direct emotional connection to someone you love.
What is a portrait? It's such a big question, and I think it's something that challenges us as viewers, something that gets us to think about ourselves as well as who we're looking at, the sitter. What can it tell us about today, our experiences, not only of looking at the work of art itself, but our experience of living in the world?
When you walk around the beautiful castle and see all these old portraits, they all have this like manifestation of power. All the people that are portrayed have power, they have money. They are the people that are well off. And now there's definitely like a democratization of the portrait, and you see all these different artists, young, old, they're all engaging with it and making it more democratic. And in that sense, it's also becoming like much more diversified, and you see so many interesting stories. And then you realize that the portrait is not about recognition. The point is we tell each other stories through portraits.
I think what's really coming through in this year's huge number of submissions is challenging identities, accepted forms of identities. And so a number of the portraits that we felt were very, very strong are doing something else with the stories that they're telling around the sitter and around that sitter's accepted identity. We've got quite a few portraits where they show the sitters almost as if they're on the cusp of different life choices or different experiences, or indeed age, on the cusp of sort of becoming an adult.
They are all portraying young people, and I think that's very interesting. We talked a lot about that, how we could be more diverse, but these three artists really got us. And I think maybe it's because when you're young and you try to form yourself in the world, that's a very delicate moment in life. And then we also have a question about bodies and how beauty ideals. We have the trans woman, who for me is also clearly an example of a very good collaboration between the sitter and the artist. Because you feel that this is not just a person being photographed, this is a person who has agency and is a part of the process of making her portrait.
You're met by this very beautiful kind of almost classical pose in one part of the work. You sense this person like instantly, intuitively. You don't need to know anything else. You just sense a very strong and at the same time delicate personality. It's a portrait that in itself works quite well. But then in the second part of the work, you have this beautiful pose, which is also very classical in like art history. You have the dancer. And I think that makes a really interesting portrait that says something about like being in the world now, and also about what a body is and what gender is. So I think it talks into all these very contemporary themes, but it does it in a very classical way.
The second portrait is a series of 5 portraits, including a self-portrait, and it shows a number of different sitters who are all quite young women. I think what the portraits, why I loved them and why we decided to choose this series of portraits is because they talk about unrootedness. I feel there's a lot of objects in some of the portraits, and then some of them are more stark, and yet they're all shown, these sitters, in sort of a liminal space. There's a fragility to them, but they are also quite powerful. And I feel that's a theme that runs through a number of the portraits that we loved so much. But for us, This one sort of encapsulated that moment of choice, of indecision, making decisions, fragility and empowerment in the most sort of beautiful, poetic statement.
We have the girl lying on the hospital bed and being really fragile, but it's also a self-portrait, so she is really very strong. I think also in her very fragile state, she's extremely strong and controls her own story. And so that's again about direction and doing something on purpose. And this is really very much on purpose.
I think seeing a life-size portrait, which is meant to be shown on the floor, and we as the viewer are looking down, that's an interesting, challenging almost position to be put in as a viewer, where your viewpoint and your gaze is shifted. Because she, the patient, is life-size, you feel you're a part of the scene. And that, for us, was very intriguing, and we just wanted to know more.
If you had asked me maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago about where portraiture was going, I would probably say it had a pretty weak future within the artistic world. Everybody looks down on the portrait, and I think in some ways they still do, because it's like, to do portraiture used to mean that you were like a hired gun. You know, you got paid to portray somebody else. But now the portrait serves a completely different function. So now it's the artist that will decide who is getting portrayed, and all of a sudden you have all these different artists using this genre to do portraits of the people they find interesting or the life situations they find interesting, and using the portrait to convey so much more than a likeliness. You know, it's no longer about like looking in the mirror, it's about something like looking like way past the mirror.